Greetings, kia ora, everyone. Inga mana, tēnā koutou, inga reo, tēnā koutou, ina iwi o te motu, tēnā koutou. There are 4 of us here today, really, running this. I would say it's a rather informal discussion. So I do know it's branded as a webinar. That's on me for a choice of a generic word. It'll be clear when I put out a couple of slides as to what we're hoping to achieve and at the end of this online event, shall I say. I am Richmond Wee. I'm the Academic Research Manager for TeLENZ. TeLENZ is the New Zealand Law Foundation funded project under their Information Law and Policy Project initiative. TeLENZ is meant to build legal capability, focusing particularly on legal or law undergrads, but also encompassing legal education generally right through. There is more information online about TeLENZ, and I would advise, if you're interested, to just Google, and you'll find a number of very interesting reports, ranging from autonomous vehicles to or driverless vehicles to blockchain to posthumous healthcare data, and particularly on the topic today, legislation as code or rules as code. I'll use both interchangeably for today and for the purpose of this discussion. With me today, there is Brendan, and I'll ask him to introduce himself right after me. Brendan is the co-chair today. Wayne has given his apologies. Something urgent and rather unexpected has come up, so very sorry for that. Wayne was meant to wear his hat on as a TeLENZ lead, while I was meant to be putting on my hat as the Veracity Lab advisory member. But I've decided I'll take on the TeLENZ hat, and we've got here Brendan, with whom I've worked very closely in the past couple of weeks in organizing this event, and it's very appropriate that he'll be speaking and co-chairing on behalf of Veracity. We've also got Nadia and Hamish. If I may, I'll introduce Nadia and Hamish first, and then I'll come to you, Brendan. Nadia Webster is the Manager, Data and Insights, Wellington City Council, and she has been the innovation lead of Smart Council. Hamish Fraser was one of the co-investigators for the Legislation as Code research report, something that we'll talk about. And he is also, and Hamish, you may want to correct me, and similarly, Nadia, you please, when I introduce you later, please tell us a bit more about yourself and what you're doing currently. Hamish was the product, or maybe is the product architect developer at the Wellington City Council. Now, Brendan, over to you, please.
Kia ora, thank you, Richmond. Firstly, great to see everybody here. I can see I've got some colleagues from overseas. Welcome to this webinar today. I'm the Associate Director of Veracity Lab, which is a science challenge spearhead project in New Zealand. We have 5 universities working together collaboratively on this work, and I just want to acknowledge some colleagues here. Richmond, of course, is on our advisory board, as is James Noble, who's here, but we've also got a chunk of our research team here, Tim Miller, Jens Diedrich, David Ayres, Matthias Golster, and Stephen Reeves. So welcome to them in particular. Veracity Lab is an exciting piece of work, and I've just put in the there we go in the chat for you to see our website. Our vision is to create a very high Veracity digital nation, and that reflects and amplifies the desired quality of life we want here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the purpose of Veracity Lab is to facilitate this deep and inclusive conversations across all areas of our digital future, and to provide some capability to incubate the research and development required for a cutting-edge, value-based, human-centered developed technology. which we want. And we've got several key partnerships we're working with. Māori with Indigenous, we're working with industry, we're working with other research facilities, education, developers, and of course government, and we're being very proactive in that area. So I encourage you, please, to go to our website, have a look at what we're doing, and in particular, the reason for today's webinar that's of interest, we are working with use cases. There's 3 use cases on artificial intelligence. We're working with artifacts and fraud with artifacts, but also with natural goods. And the exciting piece for us is we have the development of an organic products bill in New Zealand. It's in its 2nd reading. So the regulations and standards, this is quite fluid. They're being written as we speak. Well, it's after 5, might be not right now, but it is a really important opportunity for us to engage. So what does that mean? What does rules as code mean as we move and progress? So I'm just going to stop there. But one little instruction before I hand back to Richmond, the way we're both going to work today is I'm going to be looking after the chat. So when people are talking, if there's something you want to put into the chat, feel free to download some comments and questions there. I'll be looking after that, and Richard will be doing FaceTime here with everybody else in this community. So welcome everybody. Look forward to the learning from today. Back to you, Richmond.
Cool, thank you, Brendan. Nadia, may I invite you to introduce yourself, please?
Kia ora koutou. Nadia Webster, and from Wellington City Council, Manager of Data and Insights. But prior to that, I, along with Hamish, worked in all of government innovation lab called the Service Innovation Lab. So that was from the Department of Internal Affairs. The objective of the Service Innovation Lab was to bring together different public service departments to work on projects around digital service delivery, around service delivery, to where if we put the citizen at the centre of that service delivery, how might we deliver much better services, particularly where there were where people were having to interact with multiple different government departments at the same time. And through that, we kind of came across this concept around rules as code or legislation as code, because we thought about the fact that when a service is delivered, public service is delivered, it is the result of legislation, regulations, policy. And usually the intent behind the outcome of a service or a public service is actually written into the policy intent of some legislation. So we write legislation because we want to get a particular outcome, and that interpretation of how that outcome is going to happen comes through a whole chain of different people. So there's the people, the policy people who originally might help to develop what that policy intent is going to be, and there might be large amounts of public consultation around that, and then some drafting instructions are written, and then that goes to the Parliamentary Council Office, and they work with those policy people to draft that legislation. It goes through the House, it goes through different processes and democratic processes, but the actual implementation of that legislation or that rule set basically gets lobbed over the fence to some type of delivery team inside a public service department. And this is where we have a problem, because how the rule set or the let's say, for example, entitlement for social services or social service support is written in the legislation, can come into conflict with how things happen in the real world, and with various different scenarios that people hit, where they're actually sometimes trying to get a service that is being dictated by several different pieces of legislation. And so the concept of better rules, which has kind of got multiple different names, there's rules as code, there's better rules for government, there's legislation as code, it all kind of means the same concept, which is, what if we put together a bunch of people who were usually involved in this chain of events, put them together at the beginning when we're developing that legislation, and got them to talk about the concepts of what it is that they were trying to achieve. And you might have somebody in there who's actually already done some in-depth research in the social space and understanding of the use cases for the person who might be the recipient of the service, or the person who the outcomes are directed at. So if you bring those people together, and this is basically a multidisciplinary team, and that will include also the software developers who end up writing the rules of the legislation into some type of piece of software that helps support that service delivery. So that might be, help with decision making around whether somebody is eligible for a financial support, for example, or whether they're eligible to get support under the ACC legislation. And if you have the software developer in that multidisciplinary team, then they could be coding up some of those rules, and we could be throwing actual test use cases at those rules. We could be using some real live data to test them out as they get developed, and through an iterative process. What we theorised was, and this is back in about 2018, and some of the people who were involved with the original project around this are actually on this call. What we theorised was that if you do this, then you might actually end up with two really great outputs. One would be legislation written in English for people to consume, which was actually written less ambiguously. We know that it follows logic, but we also know that there is a lot of ambiguity in areas of legislation where there shouldn't be. We know there's also ambiguity in areas of legislation where it's intended to be ambiguous, because the expectation is that will be worked out through the courts. But in areas where it isn't intended to be ambiguity, and it is supposed to be formulating the decision criteria, the intent here is to be able to come up with something that is human readable and less ambiguous, but secondarily come out with the software code that represents that same logic that can be implemented a lot faster and deliver services faster. Because essentially what happens is, as soon as the legislation passes, everybody expects that it will be enacted straight away, but it'll be usually something like 1st of April or 1st of July or something, and there's a poor service delivery team in the government department who's running around trying to work out how to actually deliver this. Anyway, so that was kind of the origin for a city council. We don't make legislation, but one particular rule set that we do have is called a district plan. And so under the Resource Management Act, territorial authorities have to develop a district plan. Resource Management Act dictates what, and beneath that there's a whole bunch of standards that dictate how that needs to come together. But essentially, we were looking at it from the perspective of resource consenting as a service delivery. So one of the really important things before we got into this was to really understand, what is the point of resource consent, right? Why do we have it? Because if we don't understand the intent, we can't actually work to help to achieve that. So resource consent as a system, they provide people with permission to change land use, a council the ability to manage and plan for environmental and infrastructural impacts of changing land use, and central government the ability to regulate and monitor the impacts of changing land use and the environment. Just the context, I'm talking about the existing RMA, not any, we know that whole space is being redrafted at the moment. This is kind of a complicated thing, but this is just looking at this from multiple parts to this, looking at it from a systemic point of view from a council. So the customer expects, so the customer is an applicant for a resource consent. So that's somebody, they might be the homeowner, they might actually be an agent for the homeowner. So there could be an architect or a builder or an engineer or a planning consultant. But what they are wanting is transparency of the process and transparency of the impacts and status of their engagement of resource consent application process. They want timeliness and effectiveness of that process, and they would like to feel some type of level of control over the outcomes. There are different stages in that process. The applicant is responsible for providing a quality application. The RMA dictates what is required in an application for a resource consent, and it's not straightforward. The council has accountability to make robust, consistent and timely decisions. But they also have to consider and monitor impacts of the decisions at the property level, the neighbourhood level and at the city level, because there's a certain precedent. There's a whole bunch of information and data that flows inside and into and out of that whole process. And then out of that process, there are other implications for what happens with the information that flows in and out of that. So that includes when we're reviewing the district plan, that includes resilience planning for the city, those resource consents and buildings and the value that's added to land has an impact on property valuations, for example. And of course, for MFE, Ministry of the Environment, they need to understand how the process is working for each territorial authority, because that leads to understanding for the review of government policy. So the intent here wasn't just to look at the rule set and the process, it was to understand the whole flow of information and insights and what this was as a system before we got into how do we prove it. So basically what we thought was, where's the best place to start to improve this as a process? And we thought, well, okay, the applicant has to provide a quality application. We know that's a real problem because it is a complicated thing. The process is complicated. The district plan, which for Wellington City Council's operative district plan is over 20 years old. It's had 85 different changes in that time. It's got inconsistencies in the way it's written, the way it's laid out, your navigation. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages long. But we expect people to deliver a quality application by understanding our district plan and the RMA process. So we thought, how might we improve the likelihood of getting a quality application? So we just brought our experiment down to just looking at residential zones, which is about 60% of resource consents that come through the Wellington City Council. And we thought, what if we were to help people and guide them through understanding whether they need a resource consent or not? Now, this isn't the same as making all of the decisions, because the RMA process is first it's do you pass or fail? Do you meet the standards in the district plan? Then the next part of the equation is if you are causing issues with what you're trying to do, how you're going to mitigate those. And then there's a lot of human decision making and discretion involved in what are different ways for mitigation of those impacts. And that's definitely leaves the door open for creativity and negotiation and things. So we didn't want to touch any of that. We weren't trying to do resource planners, consent planners jobs for them. This was just a guide to help people to understand whether they need a resource consent or not, and what were the factors that were going to need to be they needed to express more in their application and draw out. So we developed a tool called Consent Check, or Resource Consent Check, and it's been up, and it's only for residential areas. And it's just taken the parts of the Wellington City Council district plan, the residential, we've coded the rules, and essentially you step through a process answering questions about what it is that you want to do on your property, and it works out whether you comply or don't comply. It guides you as to what parts of the policy in the district plan that you need to address in your application. So we launched this in January last year. And on average, it probably gets about 11 people a day using it. There's a consistent number of repeat users. And we haven't promoted it terribly widely, but we sort of work out that every time somebody goes through this process and they get to the end, that compliance summary, they are saving the council around about $155, like every time somebody does that, because that's them not calling our phone lines to ask a whole bunch of questions that we have to answer repetitively. And that's them giving us a better quality application. This is a minimum viable product or an MVP, and it was really just to prove the point. Whether this was of value, what it's done, I'm not going to take you through the tool, but you can go to consentcheck.wellington.gov.nz. You all have to know an address of a property in Wellington to be able to use it. It's really there to show what we could do. And I'll let Hamish talk about the components of this, but the essential components are the rules themselves, and also logic about what questions you ask and what order, and then bringing that all together and doing basically some type of calculation for them at the end. So it's one of those things that looks really straightforward. A real test for us is we had our project manager come into Wellington City Council, and I found out she was working on a completely different project. Found out she used to be an architect, and she had just put together. She was going through a process of applying for a resource consent, and I said, "Hey, have you used our tool?" And she sat down with her plans, and it took her 8 minutes to work out that she needed resource consent. But she'd already spent, because she didn't know about the tool, she'd already spent months trying to work it out. Huge amounts of time trying to read the plan. So it was quite telling. So we've heard quite a few stories like that. The better rules part of the story is, and we did a little bit experiment this with part of the new district plan that was being written. Unfortunately, we couldn't scale it to work on the whole district plan because it required a huge team of consultants. But essentially what we do is work through in a workshop with the planners, who basically in this case you think of as policy analysts. We talk them through the rule set, and you can't really read this, but in the green here is the standards. We talk them through how would you ask somebody, that question, how do you get to that decision logic? So we came up with a question logic. So what plain English questions would you ask? And then basically a calculation as to whether you need to go on to the next question. And then the inputs that are gathered through that go into the rules logic to work out whether the person is basically meeting or not meeting the standards, and whether you need to show them more about assessment criteria and a bunch of other things. But the method of this is going through and having those discussions and asking those questions from a layman's point of view. And then we iterated on that, and we came back to writing the standards, and we wrote them a lot more clearly, because remember, people who write district plans don't have the same skill set that people who write legislation do. For example, they don't, and lawyers, they're not lawyers, they don't know how to break things up into logic chunks. I will stop there because I've been going on for quite a long time. But yeah, Hamish can elaborate a little bit more and talk about his perspective there.
Cool. Thank you very much, Nadia. What I might do is ask Hamish to make some comments. Introduce yourself, please, Hamish.
My background was originally design, and then I got into programming. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, I ended up at the Service Innovation Lab and was asked to code the rates rebate into computer code from law. And I sat on my screen and stared at it for a couple of days, thinking this is quite dramatic, but I don't have context for what I'm doing. So I've basically been playing in that space since. It's been a really interesting journey. I took a role as a principal advisor at the Department of Internal Affairs for Better Rules for a time. And then I joined Nadia at the Wellington City Council to explore this project that she just explained. And then while I was doing that as well, I ran into Tom Barakvar and Curtis Barnes, and we ended up putting together this New Zealand Law Foundation funded report into legislation as code. That was a very good experience to go through. As a programmer, I was coming from an industry which had mantras like move fast and break things. And I was looking at the work we were doing with law going, I actually don't want to break anything, but I don't understand the context of what I'm doing other than I feel like this is significant. And so to go through that research process was really really fun in the end, and really grounding in that it gave us perspective on what it was that was working in practice, because often we would have quite different perspectives on the topics we're talking about amongst the three of us, and often where perhaps Tom and Curtis would see like conflict with things, I would say, yes, I hear what you're saying, but there's real benefits in this for when we do it in practice. And so the three of us really enjoyed that process in terms of coming to a good sense of what was right and what was wrong, where did all this fit, and uncovered lots of historical practice in this area as well, which was also really interesting. Spent a long time thinking about the wonders of natural language and natural language law, and the difference between perhaps even written law as opposed to spoken law. So that was, yeah, that was just lots of fun. I want to perhaps go through perhaps some of the benefits that we see as on the basis of that report, and then use examples that I've been involved with to illustrate those. And I wanted to just start with a primary principle that the Legislation Design Advisory Committee have laid out, which was that the law must be clear, accessible, and apply to everybody. And that first statement, the law must be clear, is I think what we're really offering here. And if we think about the rule of law and perhaps where it started, it wasn't envisaged that we'd have such complex acts such as our modern legal environment allows for. And I think that's the place where we find that computers, which are really good at running virtual models of things like buildings and cities and things like that, can actually grapple with the complexity of the law as well, and allow us to experience it without necessarily applying it. So I'm going to just drop some links into the chat as I go on different things. But in our research document, this section here, we looked at in the Auckland District Law Society sale and purchase agreement of real estate, and in the end, just realised that there was quite strong parallels between what they were doing and what this concept of legislation as code was doing. In their situation, it was a form, if you will, identifying components, and it was an interpretation of a number of different acts that have been built up over time, utilising best practice, adjusted for from different court case and case law and stuff like that. And that sense of legislation as code isn't because we spent a lot of time with our report looking at, well, what would happen if we enacted code, and all of the different variations of that. I want to skip past that and just come to our discovery was what we are doing with legislation as code is providing an interpretation, and it's providing interpretation in a practice that's already in play, and that interpretation needs to be challengeable. It needs to be versioned because it's going to change over time, and it's going to need to allow for discussion and argument, if you will, and that also mimics an open source software project. In the sense of having a repository of information that improves over time and is versioned, allows for feedback and for challenging. So that was a really nice conclusion to arrive at in terms of, well, what is it we're actually doing, and where does the value that we're seeing play? So then we looked at, so then I just want to look at some of the benefits of playing in the space. And the first one is the idea of the consistency of a shared interpretation and getting consistency with that. So in the Wellington City Council, while we were going through the process with the planners, we would end up sending the planners away for a bit of an argument because they would find, oh, I've been interpreting it this way all this time, and I've been interpreting it that way all the time. And the developers knew that. They knew that you want to get that planner if you want, that decision. And so that's ultimately not that ideal for everybody involved. And so having that shared interpretation does allow for some consistency. And we had the same experience when I did some work with the Ministry for the Environment, looking at it from the other perspective and looking at the rules for timeframes that they impose on councils and which the councils need to report on in terms of the timeframes around responding to consents and making decisions. And that was the same experience in terms of we had 70 odd councils, all utilising the rule set in slightly different versions. And I interviewed some of the councils and how they got to the decisions and processes that they did from reading the legislation. And for one of them, they used their water process engineer to come up with what the flow was that they needed to follow. But each council was doing it individually. And the result for that was when they reported their timeframes, it was quite difficult for the Ministry for the Environment to actually compile it back to some semblance of comparable form. And so the idea there is that shared interpretation could solve that problem. And also the councils are quite welcoming of the idea of actually being given a model to follow rather than having to interpret the law themselves. The second idea I want to touch on is the idea of improving policy development, and that was what Nadia talked about in terms of better rules. And that's better rules is all about getting a cross-disciplinary team in the room, getting people with experience on the ground. In a central government policy space, it's a wee bit of knocking down the ivory towers and getting everybody together, and getting that and centralizing it perhaps around a model. And that's where the computer and the code can step in, providing an interpretation which people can start to understand what everybody's discussing in the room. And certainly when we've done it in reverse, such as working with that same sort of team with existing legislation to come up with a model, you quickly realize that everybody has quite different versions of what's actually happening in the law. And it can take quite a while to come to that place of agreement around what the interpretation is. Certainly the third one I want to touch on is improving the drafting instructions that are sent between departments and the Parliamentary Council Office. And that was something that the Parliamentary Council Office was very keen on and have been involved with this work, certainly at the Service Innovation Lab's early days, and were and quite enthusiastic about it. And that idea that the actual drafting instructions can be a lot more robust, a lot more clear on what the intent is. Looking at one of the areas I've been interested in is the imbalances that are created within our society when interpreting law is hard. And this is back to really basic principles around, if we're going to have some rules, it'd be good if everybody understood what the rules were. Yeah. And that meets that conflict of well, I don't know, you've seen the Social Security Act and how long it is. I have a fun map here of it, which I could share, which as us just trying to get to terms with how it's written, let alone getting down to some of those finer points of disagreement. And so when, say, government departments basically become the de facto authority on what it is interpreted as, because for the majority of people, it's too much of a imbalanced equation to challenge anything. I think you've got away from that sense of this common understanding of what the law means, and that's where legislation as code, providing an interpretation which can compute that, much like the district plan tool does, in terms of applying it to your situation, provides an interesting area there to help rebalance. It's a long history of this tension between how the law is understood and how it's gatekept. The next point was a way to preserve institutional knowledge. So when I was working at the Service Innovation Lab, one of the first projects I was involved with there in this space was with ACC. And at the start of it, before it started, I asked the head legal representative if I could have an initial sort of introduction to the piece of the Act that we were going to be looking at, because I was completely unfamiliar with it. And I thought it would just be him and me, but the word was put out and I turned up for that meeting and the room was full of about 20 or 30 people, all from ACC. And so we did initial introductions, and as we went around the room, everybody it was their first day, or they were just completely new to the Act. And we finally get to the chap who's leading it, and he sort of opens by saying, well, once I actually looked at this piece of law, it's a lot more complex than I thought. And so I was just suddenly acutely aware of the loss of institutional knowledge that happens in this space within government departments, and having the ability to capture an interpretation and then encode, but also if that was developed that way and the scenarios that they were painting for was captured as test suites, which in a coded world is where you say, given these inputs, these are the expected outputs. If they were kept, then that team could have actually gone and reviewed those test suites and looked at what the policy intent was, and rather than having to completely reverse engineer it from scratch. And we've seen that, I've seen examples of that play out in France, where they coded their entire tax and benefit system. They had a chap there who was just a member of the public, who was also a programmer in this situation, but he was able to use that code base to prove why his test scenario, his own situation, was unfair. And so then you could have those submissions basically to the overall test suite and start to write law that attempts to deal with some of these granular absurdities that law is so often cursed with making. So in that sense, you've got an interesting design decision around, well, we could actually make law if we do it this way a whole lot more complex. And so that was but that sense of preserving institutional knowledge, I think, is perhaps often overlooked. And then stepping out to the big picture, and look at the use of digital civic infrastructure generally, and the work that's been going on in that space. I have a real interest in seeing that done well and done in the open. And the rules as code work sits right at the base of that, because right at the base of good civic infrastructure is the rules and the data. And so taking particular care with how we implement this civic infrastructure, essentially, and what as a society we want from it, I think it is a good thing to consider, and it's something that needs a lot of time spent on it. And I'd like to see infrastructure that means that a department has its layer of the legislative interpretation, and then the next layer is its small p policy work in terms of its implementation. And then on top of that, they start to build their business systems. But those bottom two layers are like publishable, and people can review them. I think that would change things considerably from what we have at the moment, where we are using digital systems, but those rules are all just a big blob in inscrutable code, and we should be able to instead be building on top of this infrastructure outside of departments and querying the law for fun apps or worthwhile and meaningful work. So that's something that's really interesting to me too. Now, out of the report that we did, we made the recommendation that we set up a lab to sort of look at that work. And certainly my experience as a developer, working within the City Council and working within the scope of one council, and then working within the scope of a particular project with, say, the Ministry of the Environment or the different things that we've been working on. There's common themes that come up, and there's a lot of work being done overseas in different areas as well that touch on those things. And so we made the point that there's been a lot of theoretical work done in this space, but we really need practice, and we really need we really need a shared place where this stuff can be unfolded and learnt from and things like that. So we have been working on the Digital Legal System Lab, which is something that we came up with as a way forward. So I'll just throw a link in for that too into the chat, since we've got something up for that now. We've been sharing that for the last year, I think, and we put out some expressions of interest near the end of last year, and we've had a really strong showing on that. And so now this is just our next step, having something up for people to look at. One of the big questions is how do you store this logic? It's one of the initial big questions that people come to. I have started to discount it a lot more as I have considered the wider ramifications of what we're doing, and perhaps the I see a lot of time has been spent in the theoretical space exploring the best computer languages, and there's a lot of space to nerd in that space. But from experience and from practice, we find that actually often the rule sets are quite unclear, unintentionally so, and certainly within a district plan level, the types of problems that we're facing aren't at that level yet in terms of the quality that some people are wanting to aim at, which is again part of that idea with the lab. And so a lot of back in the 80s, we had like there was a real push for the term escapes me, but they were there was a lot of work put in this space where they were going to provide authoritative descriptions of the law, and it sort of didn't pan out, and it didn't pan out for reasons that we identify in our report. But it's a similar trap that I think people keep falling into, is getting very much tied up in the perfect implementation, and the law and the practice are not perfect at all. And there's a lot to be gained from just getting stuff built and operating. In the situation with the district plan, I was wanting to see if we could achieve storing the logic in some form of standard, so that when the future came around, we could possibly convert it to something else much more easily than, say, tied up within a specific computer language. So we went with a format known as DMN, which I won't go into too much detail about. It's essentially an XML-based file format for capturing logic. And then the only thing that we could really process that with at the time was an open source rules engine called Rules, if we wanted to avoid a dramatically large expense step up to an American provider of a platform. And so that worked for us. When you're dealing with this work, you are often just identifying inputs, logic, and outputs. Inputs ultimately come to be represented by questions. So you also have questions, and they have to be written. There's some interesting theory around natural language law and the development of the natural language questions that go with it. So that which is interesting. So we ended up with a data set that was all of the questions and the question dependencies. We ended up with a suite of DMN files, which was all of the logic for the plan, and then also the logic for the questions done separately. And we ended up with an application that did the dance between those applying the appropriate pieces of logic to the appropriate pieces of data, and then doing the coordination with the user's inputs to produce the final report. Yeah, I think that's. I could go on for hours about that, but I think I'll bore everybody.
That's okay, Hamish. Hold that thought. I'll just say at this point that thank you very much for that. You've met actually certain parts of that Law Foundation report that you, Tom Barraclough, and Curtis Bunce authored, very much clearer for me. For those of you who haven't quite seen the report, I did put up a link before, and I don't know why this district plan is here, but can we stop sharing that one, please? Because I'm going to wave. Sorry, Nadia, was that you?
Yeah, sorry, just trying to escape.
Are you trying to escape? I could remove your co-hosting rights.
Yeah, that's fine. You do that.
Once I get to it, sorry, multi.
I've got it.
Yeah, you've got it. Okay, cool. I was just trying my best, like in a lecture theatre scenario. That's the report, and Hamish, you can see that's fairly well thumbed by me. It's 173 pages, but it's amazing how you, the three of you have put together, I don't know what proportion, but you've made things a lot more accessible. You mentioned in your presentation there that there was a lot of theory out there. Well, coming from the legal perspective and going back to as recent as 2016, when I was aware, 2015 actually, under the Law Foundation's ILAP project, the Rules as Code, Legislation as Code, or Better Rules initiatives were one of the research themes that researchers were invited to respond to and do some work. And I had to quickly do some homework as well. You did say that there's a lot of theory out there. Indeed, there was, but it was quite amazing how the three of you put together in very accessible form the thinking in that report. So that report does provide a very good platform. Thank you very much for giving that, speaking about it. You and Tom had also presented at a TeLENZ webinar, which we, TeLENZ, will make available on YouTube. I've sent that YouTube link, but there will be one particular webinar where we discuss specifically about the report. That's the first thing. The second thing is really, I was also interested in the current initiatives with a view of doing a third thing. But the current initiatives, thank you very much for talking about the Wellington City Council's consent check, I believe. And I'm sure there are other people who have noted other initiatives there. But on that note, can I just ask Fleur to go through some PowerPoint slides? I couldn't quite resist it, but I've just got 4 quick slides to show, just to sort of bring us into this. Yes, first slide, please, Fleur. Yep, that's the one. So the Law Foundation put out funding for it, and the three of you in March 2021 reported on it. Those links are there. I'm happy to forward this PowerPoint slides to all of you who are here by email, so you've got those links. And then we did give a webinar on it, TeLENZ did. Next slide, please, Fleur. Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that very quickly jumped out from the report was that the legislation as court had that appeal of the prospect that, and I've said here, quoting from the report, that legislation could be drafted and even enacted in machine executable languages and thereby modeled and executed in computer systems. And the three of you made the observation that standalone court as law is not yet, if ever, able to provide the features of natural language that the balancing of power, this is the balancing of power amongst the separation of powers theory, the legislature, executive, or judiciary relies upon. And you came very quickly, at least in the summary, the view that the short of enacted legislation as court, we can instead focus on the opportunities for approaches that would be described as non-authoritative interpretation as code. Next slide, please. I think that's probably where we land, and I would encourage people to read the report. I was interested in the very third point, which is really the purpose of this webinar, thanks to Brendan raising it with me in my Veracity Lab capacity. But leading to that, I was thinking, what are the overseas initiatives and what are the current ones? Both you and Nadia have touched on some of the current ones, and Adrian has as well. We will look at the questions later on. But I looked through the report at least as of March last year, and there are these ones here for the benefit of the attendees of this online session. There's Court Sandbox Australia. The Australian Centre for Automated Decision Making has been funded and is doing some work in the area. There's that European Research Council initiative. I think I want to attempt to pronounce it, but maybe it's called Cubicle. Okay.
I think that's how you say it.
Okay, very good. And then SMU, I've been affiliated with Singapore in very many ways, so we truncate that. But the Singapore Management University is also doing some very important work here with a couple of very well-known people. There is the Stanford Codex, and what was news to me was the Denmark and the Loken Method initiative there. Can we turn on to the next slide, please, Fleur? So really, I think what we're looking at, and I acknowledge there are a number of lawyers here, legally qualified, practicing people, a lot of computer people, quite a wide mix of people. I do recognize some names here. I think what we're seeking to achieve in this online session is not really just to talk about legislation as code as a matter of theory, but really in line with Veracity Lab, looking to do some important work in this area that aligns with their agenda, And in line with TeLENZ aim to build legal capability, we've got access to the undergrads. We're involved in legal education at various levels, or at least we're trying to. We're looking to explore really with those of you here who have very kindly attended this evening, what could we possibly do here in New Zealand to create that space? It's interesting that I hadn't realized this till I read the report very closely, although it was very clear that the three of you called for an incubator, a multi-stakeholder incubator. I mean, the lawyers we only know so much. We see some of the issues, but we don't have the technical IT skills, computer skills to bring about it. It really has to be done by a multidisciplinary group. And here in academia, as well as Veracity Lab too, we can offer that space to trial something, and what that something is, we're happy to do it. So anyway, I'll hit a pause on that note and ask Brendan if he's got some comments to make. And Brendan, you're monitoring the questions too, so can we pick up some of the questions that have been raised and also invite others to come in on to this general part of the session now?
Okay, yeah, thank you. And we do have a flurry of questions that have come in, and so I'm just going to go in order really, and what I'd like to do is just get to the person we asked to speak to sort of summarise, because some of them have asked more than one question, the questions are building. So in order that I have to date, I've got Stephen Insulin, David Ayres, Adrian Yins, and Steve Reed with some questions. You don't have to ask them, it's been answered in the chat. But Stephen, do you want to kick off, please?
Sure, thank you. So I'm a software engineer. I'm not a lawyer. I'm coming to this from that perspective. I think there are some very important things we should be aiming for in terms of algorithm transparency and software transparency. And I think that examples are extremely powerful, and including them in legislation would be great. But I also think that legislation as code is a mistake, that we're really talking about non-authoritative interpretation. And the non-authoritative part is extremely important. Yeah, so I just want to hear some discussion about that difference between authoritative and non-authoritative.
I would agree, and we really struggle with the language on this when we were trying to write the report. I just threw a link in the chat there to the section in the start of the report where we finally stopped pulling our hair out and just thought we'd describe the problem that we were grappling with around terminology. I'd
also jump in and just sort of say, and I am only talking about the resource consent space, but the people who are interpreting it right now are the Wellington City Council resource consent planners. So they are the authoritative interpretation because they are the ones that are checking whether a consent is complying or not with their rule set. And what we have put into the tool is their interpretation. So it's an authoritative interpretation from them as authorities, officers of the council. It's their authoritative interpretation of their own rules.
Okay, but we are talking in that as a good example, but we're also talking in a wider context as well. I think, Nadia, that that there are people who have authority, who have to make authoritative decisions, correct? Size of something, height to boundary, all of those types of issues. Right, so there are points where there is authority. David, you kind of followed David Ayres, you followed through on that with something. Do you want to pick up on something, David?
I can't easily talk, but I got the answers to the questions. Thank you already.
Thank you. And then Adrian.
Well, I mean, my comment would be like the authoritative and non-authoritative thing, and the whole, legislation and code is a little bit of a red herring in some ways, because in the end, it's really about people's lives and providing tools for them. And I think and this is something I think that Nadia touched on. I mean, if if an administrator of the law who has authority says, I want people to use this tool and I will be bound by the outcome of it, well then, I mean, that's fine. I mean, that's actually how the law works. I mean, authority is vested in the person that has the authority, and they can, and if it's within their delegation to do whatever it is that they like with it, then in fact they're bound by that, and they can do that. I mean, that's part of like our constitutional arrangements in actual fact. So, I mean, you get a situation where someone might say, well, if you fill out this form, truthfully, I mean, there's always the caveat that has to be you can't lie. If you fill out this form online and submit it, you know, if you tick the right boxes, then you get this result. And we actually see that in the fiscal area and in the passport area and in lots of areas. And in actual fact, in America, there's a process called for companies. It's called tick the box. If you tick the box, you get a result. And so that is authoritative, right? And in some ways, you can say, well, I mean, yes, code shouldn't be law per se, but it has the same function of law. And I came across this when I talked to PCO. I'm a drafter myself. The thing about law is like, well, it has no effect unless it has an effect. And that sounds a little bit weird, but I mean, you can have legislation, but how it's implemented and how at the point end of service delivery, which Nadia knows all too well, how that works is actually what the law is, right? I mean, you can have a piece of legislation, and this happens all the time, that's administered completely differently from what a pure lawyer might even think it should be done. And that's really what the law is. It's an action, it's social control on people's lives. So in some ways, the legislation part of things is kind of like, it's not irrelevant, but PCO, they thought, yeah, well, we're not responsible for service delivery, but as a lawyer that wants to, and as a policymaker and as a lawmaker, you want your law to actually have an effect, right? And the way that happens these days is through digital tools, right? So the whole authority, non-authority thing, I think, is a little bit of a red herring, and the whole legislation as code's a little bit of a red herring, because in the end, as HLA Hart said, nothing succeeds like success. And at the moment, what seems to be happening is like digital services, right? Whether they're authoritative or not, or however you want to term them constitutionally, are what's succeeding, right? So we have to deal with the fact that algorithms are starting to run our lives in the legal area as well, and use that as our base. And I think the whole terminology thing is a little bit of a red herring.
How about this is a practical approach to it, and this really. Sorry, Adrian. Sorry for coming in. I really quite. And Adrian and I have talked in person before, so sorry for coming in. But as a practical matter, and I raised this because when Brendan asked if we would host something like that or enable a discussion like that to happen, my one overarching thought was that, okay, I'm legally qualified and all that, but taking the view of a citizen or a ratepayer or a person out there, struggling with a whole lot of rules, you know, they either need to comply or want to comply, or, you know, there's an aim or objective for it, whether it's, for example, accessing a KiwiSaver for a first home, applying for a license of some sort, whether that's a fishing license or a gun license, wanting to do some stuff on their piece of land and being involved with, say, the Wellington City Council. But there are a whole lot of rules out there. And as lawyers, we know that there are different types of rules, whether they come from primary legislation, delegated legislation, bylaws, or even professionals have best practice guidelines, or even standards. Various industries have standards. I thought one of the, if not appeal, but attraction of at least this way of doing stuff, whether it's legislation as court, rules as court, or whether in automating this stuff, would be, it would at least help in either in an advisory, discretionary, non-direct, no, it's not a compulsory way. It would actually advise and, you know, if not enlighten or help people get some idea of whether they can be in compliance, if not actually, on the other hand, perhaps a government body, whether it's central or local government, may put out and own such a tool and then say, if you tick this box, Adrian, as you said before, therefore you'd qualify and we would back you totally because, you know, we developed this. or they can have an out clause to say, essentially that 90% of your work is done, we will consider it and get back to you, and you can submit further, information, and we will exercise our discretion, legal discretion or whatever it is, to provide that approval. So from a practical point of view, I thought, and in terms of Veracity's work, and also in terms of building capability in TeLENZ, I thought there was a lot of scope in exploring some initiatives here, because at the moment, for me and for I think a number of our colleagues, either we are grappling with the term itself, or we don't know what it is, or we know what it is, but it's still very theoretical and it's not that practical. And therefore, I thought it's been really very helpful and valuable with Nadia and Hamish sharing the information with us, plus the comments on the chat too. So I come back to the question, and I know, Brendan, you're administering the questions now. I come back to the question now, is there something out there that we could do in addition to, in parallel with, but by no means taking over or overlapping or duplicating what's already being done? Is there something that can be done, or are there a number of potential areas of law or instances where Veracity perhaps could explore? Back to you, Brendan.
Richmond, can I just jump in, because I've actually got to go. I'd just like to pick up on two things really quickly. We've done some work for the central banking system in Italy, and the commercial banks, which the Reserve Bank oversees. The first thing the commercial bank said, "Oh my goodness, are we going to be bound by this?" Okay, so we put out a whole bunch of rules, and the first thing that, and of course that's kind of like, that's a fair enough question, and so we were seeing it more as like an aid to them. So if you code up the rules, then it's kind of like a different way of reading it. It's like XML, right? No one blinks about XML. They say, in actual fact, it's interesting because law already is code. XML is technically code. And the website actually has the XML version of it. And so when we put out an executable version of the EU banking regulations, they all went, "Oh, we don't want to be bound by that." But we saw it as like a way to actually help them understand the rules, which I think is a major point. And the same when we did some stuff for the UK. They've mapped their system over there for universal credits.
Yeah.
And we've kind of ended up as it's become a navigation tool rather than actually like saying what your entitlement is. It's a way to navigate through the complexities of the labyrinth, right, of their law. So you've got all these different ideas. There's a myriad of different ideas that go into making your entitlement up, right? And you can actually use rules as code to like navigate through the complexities. It will give you an answer, absolutely, and like I said, in some ways, that could be a definitive entitlement, or it might not be. But the very fact that you've got someone being a computer holding your hand through these complexities and exposing some of the byways and highways, it's another form of reading almost, So I mean, I think there's a number of use cases, and the whole this is going to be published as law is not necessarily one of them. Anyway, so I'm sorry I have to go, and I'm sorry for hijacking things a little bit, but I just wanted to say that. Okay.
Good, Adrian.
And I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Yeah. So clearly, this has lit up the discussion a little bit, but I just want to come back to Steve and Jens. Steve Reeves and Jens, who are part of Veracity Lab, because you both made substantial comment in the chat previously. And I think if there's anything you want to pick up for Veracity Lab at all, Jens, do you want to try to go first? Is there anything?
Yeah, sure, I can do this. Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, really, really interesting discussion. I really enjoyed this. So I hinted in the chat that I have been involved in that kind of work like 10, 20 years ago, but moved a little bit away from this, and now maybe back with Veracity. So the one question I really had is when you code up rule legislation as code, other use cases are your systems that support that the end user does not just see the consequences of applying the rules, but also the rules themselves in order to better understand the decisions that has been made, because that is something that is relatively close what we are working on in Veracity, at least in that part of Veracity where I am operating at the moment. And if that is something that is not yet there, but you would like to move towards, then certainly there would be opportunities for us to work together in this space. So yeah.
So the consent check tool does basically explain to you, you get to a compliance summary and it says you put in this, the tolerance value was this. You get a red tick or, a red cross or a tick. Basically, it's explaining what the thresholds were. And even as you enter your information, it's saying, if you go above the threshold or if you answer no to this, you will need to apply for a resource consent. So it is a guide, very much guiding you through. It also links to the specific text in the district plan. So it's got the interpretation through the rules logic, the interpretation through the question, the interpretation through plain language, and then it's got the exact rules as written in the district plan. So you can compare and contrast that as well.
Right,
We didn't want to be in a position where we were trying to reinterpret this rule set because there's a statutory process to do that, so we can't do that. We had to be very clear that we were saying the same thing as the original rule set, and we presented it alongside each part of it so people can see the whole thing. It's a little bit of overload, and it's interesting to see that people just get really used to it and then they don't look at all those things. And we added a huge amount of definitions of terms as well, because the unfortunate reality is we had to use the language of the district plan, and that uses non-normal person language, right?
All right, yeah.
It's planning language. It's written for planners, by planners. It says residential unit when you might say dwelling or house or something like that. It says accessory building when you might say garage. So we had to put in a huge amount of this additional definitions for people to put it into plain language to say this is what it means when it says this.
Yeah.
So
that would have been my thank you. Yeah, that would have been my follow-up question. Is how much engineering effort was in there to actually achieve this. What we try to work towards is to automate a lot of this, even if you wouldn't use something like rules. And I'm not quite sure what kind of built-in support a computational engine like tools have. It wasn't very great 6 years ago last time I looked into this, but that was 10 years ago. It might have changed dramatically, but so can you kind of estimate how much custom coding or how much more expensive did it make it to build that particular feature?
So we basically used other tools, but the main thing here is we had an operational objective, and that was we wanted it so that the planners themselves, the ones who write the plan, could use the tool to update the logic. We wanted a low code. You just need to understand logic to be able to do this. So that was one of the other reasons we used Drills. Drills has got great ability to be able to run test suites against the rule set as well. So you can create a whole lot of test scenarios, like hundreds and hundreds of lines of test scenarios across each rule set as well. But Hamish did have the actual code that he had to do was pull the APIs together and have them represent on the page. But Hamish can talk about that more.
Can I just quickly ask, were there any particular limitations you ran into? Because I was interested in the generalization, which is the questions I was asking about before, because I see a real benefit to this if you can reduce the code easily for people to do similar or different, related use cases. What were the key barriers you actually ran into in terms of what the rules engine could do for you and the difficulties of building the software?
I think replication of logic was across similar rule sets, but Hamish, I think, has worked out how to do that better. So we're going into a project to take the new rule set and do a similar delivery, and we've worked out how to do that better, but I'll leave it to Hamish to answer a bit more.
Thank you.
Yeah, certainly I've always been clear within the council that Drills isn't really my fave application at all. But in this situation, because of the objective was to try and use this standard with the hope that the planners could manage the logic themselves. Drills in the end was the only platform that was going to provide that processing for us. I would suggest if you were looking into this, there's a whole lot of work being done that the Cogito group who are behind Drills are doing, which is essentially working a way to code around their dependency on Drills altogether. So you can now edit DMN files quite nicely in the VS Code editor, and I've found ways to deploy and execute without utilizing the Drills engine at all. So that's been helpful. The simplicity that we're looking to achieve in the second time around is more, I think, due to the stricter planning standards that have improved for the actual plan writing. So we have a much more clearly structured document to work with. And the last time we ended up coding based on theme. So we did earthworks, we did building height, but it looks like this time we'll be able to actually model instead the structure of the plan. So we'll have an MRZ, a medium density residential 5.1 type of file, and that will directly relate to that part of the plan. So it'll be much easier to trace.
Thank you.
And I think that comes to a really key. Sorry, that comes to a really key point about the quality of the original rule set and how structured it is and consistent it is.
The existing district plan literally has side notes and a sidebar and things like that. So we were trying to replicate it digitally, and we literally had to have like this piece of content will be found in the sidebar. So there wasn't a sense of document flow at all.
I mean, look, I would like to stay in contact and maybe just have a one-on-one meeting. Yeah, I'm based in Wellington. I'm not sure, Hamish, are you based in Wellington as well, or?
I like to be, but I'm currently in Taranaki.
Oh, okay. But anyway, so I contact you after the meeting and we can set something up. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Steve.
Yeah, I think my question's been answered, but I just wanted to, if I can, reflect on some of the stuff that Nadia and Hamish have been saying, which is really interesting, which has sparked off the idea of, is it ever going to be feasible to turn this around? In other words, we've heard a lot about the fact that we need humans there to interpret stuff and to work on the edge cases and so on, which if I was being really unfair, I would say that's lawyers protecting their patch. Turn it around and have people trained in expressing rules, and the drafting of law starts from the expectation that these rules will be expressed in some formal way, rather than doing what we seem to be talking about all the time, which is humans have come up with these vague, in some ways, rules, and we're trying to formalize them. Why not turn that around and say, here is the formal language in which the rules will be written, now go away and write the laws. And I think the French example, is an example perhaps of a good outcome there. There's always going to be some human interpretation needed, I guess, but just a question of how far could you feasibly go with this, rather than trying to solve a problem which seems to be insoluble. You turn it around and the problem isn't there anymore.
So the original
Steve.
rules.
Oh, sorry, Nadia, and then Andrew, because Andrew's made a chat. So across to you, Nadia.
Sorry. So the original investigation into this involved a very experienced drafter from Parliamentary Council office. So, and we involved some other legal professors as well. So essentially what we tried to do was to convince Parliamentary Council office that was a good idea. We tried to convince senior policy people, the lead for policy in government, that was a good idea and we should do more experiments around doing that with legislation as it was being drafted. There's just not that many people who are game, and we even tried to influence it in the development of the new Resource Management Act and things like that. There is an entrenched position in how you do these things, and that's why we have to come up with more and more use cases. So we have tried and tried to influence different pieces of legislation. Pim might be still on the call. I think him and he was involved with, for example, Holidays Act. Hamish and I were involved with aspects of that as well. But it's influencing the system and the momentum of current practice.
Yeah, Andrew Ecclestone.
Hello.
Want to have a check?
I've been quite happy just to participate in the written chat, but I think, I find the discussion interesting. What I'm interested in is that often when I see discussions about the domain rules as code or better rules online, advocates for it sometimes get overexcited, and definitely Hamish and Nadia aren't in that category of overgeneralizing, but I have seen some people overgeneralizing about the potential uses and expansion of this approach to areas of the law that is not a matter of lawyers defending their turf. I'm not a lawyer, I should very carefully say, but is a recognition that much of the law is, and how the law is applying principles that you can articulate in the law, but that are recognized to be highly context dependent, both on the facts and at the time that the person has to make the decision. And so I think it's important that people working in this space of rules as code or better rules can articulate, this is the domain where we think this approach is viable. And welfare benefits where there is not an area of human discretion is definitely one of them. But you may have a process which says we can have rules as code that does, for example, documentation check that you've submitted all the information needed for the decision maker to make the decision, but it's still up to this MSD official or whatever to apply their judgment as to whether or not you should get this discretionary grant or loan or so on. As opposed to something like a rates rebate calculation where you've got a formula in law to apply, you put in your income level, you put in the rates level, a mathematical formula is applied and out pops an answer where there is not space for human discretion. And more importantly, it's less context dependent on the time that you're making the call, the decision. So has anybody started articulating those boundaries is really the question.
From my experience, I think the answer is sometimes found in the attempt to code it. If there is so much human discretion and lack of process described in the law, you get to the point where your program is meaningless. But often, even when the situations where there's a lot of human discretion, a lot of timing and things like that, there's still actually a process described by the law. And even just describing the process, you need to talk to this person needs to make a judgment, then this person needs to make a judgment. Even describing that is useful.
Yeah.
As a guide. I kind of like to think of it in my own mind as an architect modeling a virtual house so that the owners can walk around in it before they buy it. And you can sort of explore it, but when there's lots and lots of discretion, it becomes more and more meaningless. You might have you walk down the hallway and then you can go through this room, but it might be that actually we're not even sure if we're building a house yet, So you can sort of imagine there'd be areas of the house that would be really grey and fuzzy because it's actually there's nothing to be decided. And at that point, your code might just have first this person needs to make a decision, that person needs to make a decision. It's actually a 3-step process and that's it. And it might at that point be decided there's no point in coding that, but there's not enough lifting. Yeah. But say with the Social Security Act, when we've been doing some work on that, and when you look at the emergency benefit, when you try and code the emergency benefit, which is meant to be for in an emergency, which generally suggests that there's a time pressure, to calculate if you're eligible for the emergency benefit, you have to calculate if you're eligible for any other benefit first. You have to run all of the calculations before you can find out if you're eligible for the emergency benefit, which seems really counter application in real life. And so in that scenario, if you can have those calculations running, you could start to much more quickly answer the question. Although to answer the question of which benefits you're eligible for, if you have to ask them all, you have to fill in a very large form. There's a lot of inputs in that. So I think personally that should be a redesign of that policy, in terms of you shouldn't need to answer all of the other benefits before you get to the emergency one.
Thank you, Hamish.
I was just going to say there's also scope, and we've had to do it in a few of these instances where there is easily coded logic, and then you step out of that process to human makes decision, human comes back and puts into the process what the result of that decision is, and that goes to the next step. So there are bits where there is discretion in the middle of calculatable processes, so we can allow for that type of thing as well. But in the, I was just going to say to your original point about has anyone defined the scope of this, in the original discovery document, we did define the scope. We said that this was useful for these types of things, eligibility, you know, those types of things. It is not for all legislation.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's really helpful. I mean, as somebody who investigated complaints for the Ombudsman for a decade or so, I could see a lot of this working in the immigration space, but even within the immigration space, you get to areas of the law where you're down to a human value judgment. So, for example, has somebody got an acceptable standard of health? And does that does the disbenefit or the potential cost in New Zealand outweigh the benefits of them as a migrant and so on? Sorry, Brendan needs me to wrap up.
Okay, no, just Andrew, thank you very much. Just a very subtle little prod on the side. Hey, because I'm just going to say to wrap up from Veracity Lab, and thank you all so much. When I was talking, like the wealth of experience, the practical and applied, and I'm sure our team will be in touch with everybody. I'm in Wellington in a couple of weeks. I'm certainly going to be reaching out to a few. This is a community of interest, and we've got Richmond on our advisory board. It's really important that we communicate openly and share. I think there's a very strong common interest, and to keep the dialogue going. And obviously, I'm left with a lot more questions that I have answers. Very invigorating. Thank you all very much from Veracity Lab. Over to you, Richmond.
Well, yes, 3 points to make, really. We had, I think, at one point, 28 names. Second point, so thank you very much for all of you who've attended. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks, Brendan. Thanks to the people who have been involved in the Q&A aspect. Second point is there is the intention or aspiration to have that collaborative initiative. Look, TeLENZ is partly funded. Veracity is partly funded. We've got the people. We're in academia. We're involved in research, in education. Essentially, what can we do to at least trial some of these things sort of in alignment with what other groups are doing. So the next thing, the third and next thing is I found this to be really helpful and valuable. It's also like Brendan's left me a lot of questions, but it's also clarified quite a few things for me. So I would like to have more specific meetings or enable those through my advisory capacity, as well as push or drive some initiatives from academia. TeLENZ involves all 6 law faculties and schools, and also the universities involved, and even those who don't have law schools, but we've got the computer people, we've got the social scientists, we've got the whole works. So I would like to explore what specific thing we can do. And with your permission, I'll be in touch by email to make contact to see if there's interest in having more specific meetings rather than this much more formal one. Also, we're planning to make this YouTube clip video available. If you've got any concerns, it will probably take us a good few weeks to edit and go through. But if you've got any concerns that you do not wish any part of it to be made publicly available, please could you get in touch with us and let us know. On that note, thank you again very much. We are determined to end this by before 6:30. Well, I do know that I'm going to be speaking to a number of you individually or in small groups. Thank you very much. On that note, have a good evening.
And thank you, Richmond, for your organisation of this. Wonderful.
Cool.
Ka kite anō.
Ka kite.
Okay.
Mate wa.